Welcome to Historic Living Modern World. I'm your host, Gregory Shelton. Today is a very special day because we're on the Kalmar Nyckel and its 25th anniversary date.
Welcome to the Kalmar Nyckel Foundation and the Copeland Maritime Center. I'm really excited that you're here today, and I'd love to just show you around.
I would love to see it. So Kathy, I can't believe the Kalmar Nyckel is inside this building.
Seriously?
It obviously is not. So what exactly are we on right now? Because I'm already getting seasick. So
you are?
Yes.
Okay. So really? We're not moving. So this is a 2/3 scale replica of the main deck of the Kalmar Nyckel, and we use this really largely for our education program. They will raise and lower the sails. They will. We have some cannons over here. We do a gun drill with them, and so when the kids are inside, this place is just echoing with noise and excitement. But these are some of the stations for the children. The other thing that this has become very beneficial for is that we have crew training programs that we run as well. And so we have a big class in the wintertime. And so they actually use this to practice raising and lowering sails because in the wintertime, everything comes off the ship. So there's no opportunity to practice any sailing with sails and rigging. So this has turned out to be a very, very practical model. And then also, we do have events here. We've used this as seating for lectures. We've had parties.
I would have loved to be on this when I was a kid. And I know you guys do a lot for the children of Delaware and the schools of Delaware.
Yes.
What does it mean to a child to learn what happens on the Kalmar Nyckel and learn that history?
So it's an incredible experience. One of the things that really makes our programs, I think, different than a lot of other programs is that it is so hands-on, and kids love to be moving and doing while they're learning, because they're learning actively, but also passively in how they're spending their time.
Today we're here with Captain Lauren of the Kalmar Nyckel. Thank you very much for making the time for us.
Absolutely, welcome aboard.
Thank you.
So the Kalmar Nyckel is a replica of the sailing ship that came here to what is now Delaware in 1638 from Sweden and founded the colony of New Sweden then. That was the first permanent European settlement in this area. So we're kind of like the local Mayflower. The 17th century, we believe that the sailors actually got to live up in this funny little dark area up here. This is called the forecastle.
Okay.
And they would have been sleeping on blanket pallets. This was even before Europeans were using hammocks.
Wow.
Back then, so just right down on deck. And of course, half of the sailors were working at any given time, which meant that only half had to be in here sleeping. And then when it was shift change, you came off of work and you crawled into somebody else's nice warm blankets. And so not a lot of personal space. And that person who had been sleeping there, off they go to work. So nowadays, fortunately, we don't have to live in the forecastle. Mm-hmm. And while we do still work in 2 shifts, so half of the crew is awake and half of the crew is asleep, everybody gets their own bunk to keep their own stuff in down below. We're a modern crew, so we like to be able to do things like wash our clothes and take showers, wake up in the morning, make coffee in the coffee pot. So we have all of that down below, but up here on deck, we're pretty traditional actually.
So when you think about the men that were sleeping here, and you think about them coming from Sweden and Finland, from what we've understood, was that an illustrious job or a really hard-working job and with no pay, and just be happy you're coming to a new world?
This was a tough job. Actually, the first group of settlers that came to the New Sweden colony were soldiers. So they were actually dispatched by the Swedish military to go form a colony. And then later, they had the opportunity to head home to Sweden. One of the challenges of the New Sweden colony is it was hard for them to get people to sign up to go live in the New World. because conditions at home weren't really that bad.
Right.
So this is not one of those stories like the Mayflower where there's religious persecution necessarily involved. So it was actually one of the challenges was to build up enough population to make this colony thrive. While we do have lots of things that are more modern on the ship than they would have been in the 17th century, a lot of the work that we do is very traditional. So I just wanted to point out one of our simple machines that we have on board. This is real 17th century sailor work. So this thing is called the Windlass.
Okay.
And it's a huge winch. Okay?
Gotcha.
So we think of winches as like having wire and, you know, you pull your car out of the mud or whatever.
Right.
But this is a 17th century winch. It can lift all kinds of heavy objects, including, for example, the anchor. This rope here is actually attached to the anchor out forward.
You can use both a mechanical thing and or this?
So we only have this.
Okay, great.
So pull it back.
Very cool.
So if we drop the anchor and we want to lift it up, this rope can kind of be brought tight around the windlass. So you can see if I push down on this bar, it rotates the whole entire windlass, and that will just reel up the anchor basically like a fishing reel.
Gotcha.
So because this bar is very long, this functions as a type of lever. The simple machine is actually called a wheel and axle.
Okay.
And the long bars give me 10-to-1 mechanical advantage. So I have 10 times my strength when I do this.
Okay. Just from the design,
right? And that is how, just from the design of the device, and that's how, you know, 4 or 6 people can raise the 900-pound anchor that we have that might be stuck in the mud on the bottom. That's really how we do this today. And when you look up at the rigging on the Kalmar Nyckel, all of these heavy things that are up there, masts, yards, which are the horizontal pieces of wood, sails, those all, they don't fly, they get lifted up there by our simple machines like the Windlass with the crew operating them.
Well, that's,
so that is a really traditional.
You can see from an architectural perspective, it's a beautiful, it's just so beautiful. And it's nice to know you guys went back in time to kind of still do this. And how many men would it take to really operate this on a daily basis?
So depending on the job, there are 4 bars. So often we can just do it with 4 people. If we have something real heavy, we can put 2 people on a bar, so you can get it up to 8.
Okay.
That's about the functional limit of how many people you can fit and not be, you know, elbowing each other in the eyeballs and so forth. So, but yeah, it does reduce, you know, if you were going to pull up a 900-pound anchor just by hand over hand, we're talking 30, 40 people. So it's a lot.
Captain Lauren, I love this kind of gargoyle look of this bell. It really says a lot from it's really the main thing you look at. Tell me about that.
Absolutely. So the bell is an interesting item, right? So ships of this period did have bells on board. Bells have been found, but we don't actually know if the original Kalmar Nyckel had a bell like this. However, this bell is required for us to have as a signaling device by the Coast Guard and international signaling treaties and so forth. So we have to have a bell, whether it's traditional or not. And this is sort of an interesting question that we can pass on to the archaeologists. But because we have our bell here and it's mounted, we want to mount it in a very traditional fashion. Okay. So carvings and elaborate decoration were typical of ships of this period in Northern Europe. The fancier you could be, the more wealth and power it indicated. So our gargoyle here, he is keeping an eye out for bad weather. We affectionately refer to him as Fred.
Fred.
And you can see that when he goes to sea, sometimes he doesn't feel so good, so that's why he turns green.
So Captain Lauren, I see a killer cannon here. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So our cannons are real and they do work. They are replicas that were cast for the ship when she was built 25 years ago. The design is supposed to be of the right period for a Swedish warship. The Kalmar Nyckel spent a lot of her life attached to the Swedish Navy, whether directly as a naval ship or almost like a lease program, which was a thing they did back then, different from now. But she did carry cannons for most of her life, if not all of it. And she did get in a few battles as well, so kind of an interesting life that the original ship had. Our cannons do have a crest that is cast into them that is from the Swedish king in the 1620s, which is probably when the Kalmar Nyckel was built. And nowadays, we don't fire any shot because we don't really want to hurt anybody,
Sure.
but we can shoot gunpowder and make a big bang. So sometimes when we arrive in a new port or want to celebrate something, we will fire our guns. Just to make sure
How many
everyone knows
guns
we're
are we
here.
talking on the ship?
So the original Kalmar Nyckel carried probably 10 to 12 guns, depending on her, exactly what she was doing at any given moment in her life. But today we have 4, and in part that's to make room for other things that we carry now that they wouldn't have back then, like boxes full of life jackets, for example.
Sure, gotta have
considered important in the modern world.
Yeah, so fire first, ask questions later.
Basically, yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful piece, and it's great to know you guys have all the heraldry and the crests on, because that says a lot, and it
Pretty
really
fun,
is.
yep.
It's beautiful, really incredibly well done. So I hear we're in the great cabin, or the captain's quarters. Tell me, how's it feel to be in here for yourself?
This is, the coolest bedroom I could ever ask for.
The carvings, it's so beautiful.
It really is amazing. It is also a little bit like living in a museum.
Okay.
Because it's a space that the public doesn't come in, but they get to take a look around. So that's always something that we have to kind of keep in mind, is that we're in sort of a public-private situation. We also have, a lot of the crew does work in here.
Okay.
For example, on the deck or the floor are these stern lines that are holding the ship right now to a dock. They'll walk out through that door and go do that. So all part of life here in the great cabin.
And I thought to ask, what's the Wi-Fi password here? Because my phone's, no, I'm just kidding. So listen,
We do have that.
So
yeah.
you've been the captain here for 16 years, 16 wonderful years. I would imagine that you love your job every day. What is it? What were you like when you were a teenager? Because this is a big deal.
So I actually sailed dinghies as a young child. I started when I was 8, and I grew up in Connecticut on the shore of Long Island Sound. And I went to sailing school, little kid. And I love sailing, but as I actually became a teenager, I started to be less in love with the being by myself in a tiny boat for hours and hours and hours every day out of my summer. We spent a lot of time racing, which is, for me, repetitive. You sail in the same
little sunfishes and things like that.
Yeah, that
Yep,
kind of thing. You kind of sail in the same little pattern. And so as a teenager, when I wanted friends and I wanted, more of a life, I sort of moved away from sailing. When I was in college, I discovered tall ships through a semester abroad type study program. They were like everything that my dinghy wasn't, right? So there were other people on board,
hard
there
work,
was a community,
fun.
I could walk around the ship, it would take me somewhere new. It was like everything I loved about sailing, in like the perfect package. And
Gotcha.
So I went home from that semester on a sailing ship, and I told my parents that I was going to be a sea captain.
Right. So what do your parents think of the job that you do every day?
Oh, they think it's pretty neat.
Very cool.
Yeah, my mom, carries a little photo of the ship with her. Now it's in her phone, but she used to have the little, actually printed out copy.
So we talked about you being, learning sailboating, that kind of thing. Are you also consider yourself a history buff?
So interestingly, I have learned to be a history buff really since getting this job on board the Kalmar Nyckel. I consider myself a science buff, and I got involved with tall ships through more of like an oceanography pathway, but I love the engineering, I love the physics, I love the meteorology, I love all of the things that make sailing science are kind of my wheelhouse. And I've added the history in since I ended up with a job on a very historical sailing ship.
So when you talk about what a captain has to do, they have to be proficient in all the things that you talked about to be a true captain. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. And you also nowadays have to add things like diesel engine repair and plumbing and
Right.
everything that might go wrong.
Are you also involved? Are you also
challenging.
involved in the idea that when you have to make repairs and you have to really update this thing to be Coast Guard approved? Is that also your job?
Absolutely, yep.
Wow. Do you spot the problems, or you take notes from the crew, or?
All of the above. So I try very hard to stay on top of things. I try very hard to train and encourage the crew that when they see something they think might not be right, to come and report it, and not to feel like they're imposing on our time or anything. If they say, you know, I saw this and not really sure. We've had a lot of crew discover things that were wrong, really wrong, and give us some warning.
Wow.
You know, over the years, it's happened.
Well, I look at the Kalmar Nyckel as one of the hidden gems of Delaware, and I really want to thank you for making the time. The work that you do is amazing. I really want to thank you again for making time to allow us on the ship. Thank you. Today we're so lucky to have the Kalmar Nyckel shipbuilder here, Mr. Alan Rawl. Thank you very much for making the time.
A pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Tell me what it felt like actually getting this project built and launched and rolling.
Well, I started with it actually 35 years ago, and I got a call from the Mr. Nick DuPont, asked if I'd be interested in building a ship he was involved with, and I said I'd think about it. We talked about it, and eventually we came to terms and started right in. This was 1987, and it took us a while, took the foundation a while to get running well enough to raise funds to keep the project going, because we didn't want to start and then stop. And they did a wonderful job at that. And finally in 1994, we laid the keel, and we were ready to go full time, and we launched in 98, September 28, 98. It was commissioned the following spring, and she's been operating well ever since. And she's Delaware's tall ship. She represents Wilmington and Delaware very well. She's actually, among our peers, she's known as the Queen of the Fleet, which is quite a title. And it's just been a wonderful experience from beginning, it's in the end, but to date. And I see her sailing for many, many more years to go.
So when you think of this year being the 25th anniversary of its initial launch, how does it feel to experience that as the guy that actually built this beautiful ship?
It feels great. It did then and it does now. My wife and I are partners in this business. We built 5, including a miniature ship, but 5 of them, and I'm proud to say they're all at least floating, and they're all working as originally intended. And that's a good feeling. But it's I'm the builder, but I just supervise. At peak, I believe we had 43 full-time paid craftsmen and 80 some volunteers that were local and wanted to work on the ship. And most of them, probably all of them, stayed to sail on the ship later and made it as great as it is. It is just a wonderful example of what a project can be like if everybody plays their part well.
So on behalf of everyone in Delaware, I really want to thank you for making the time. And I want to thank you for designing this amazing piece of history for Delaware. And thank you very much for taking the time.
My
thank
pleasure.
you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.